It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Cedar Creek, a small village tucked away in the woods of rural Appalachia, had always been the kind of place where time moved slowly, and people knew each other's business before the sun went down. I was looking for some peace, some quiet after a rough year. What I didn't expect was that the quiet would become suffocating. I drove into Cedar Creek late on a Friday afternoon. The town was small, just a few houses lining the main road, an old general store, and the church that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. It was exactly what you picture when you think of a remote, old-fashioned American village. Nothing fancy, just people living simple lives. I'd rented a cabin just outside town from a woman named Mrs. McAllister, who greeted me with a forced smile and a handshake that lingered just a bit too long. "You'll be fine out there," she said, her voice thick with an accent I could place. "Just don't wander too far in the woods after dark. The pines are best left alone." I nodded, thinking it was just some old superstition. In small towns like this, people always have their odd warning. I didn't think much of it at the time. The cabin was charming, nestled at the edge of a dense pine forest. The evening passed without incident until I went to bed. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something tapping lightly on my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch swaying in the breeze. But then it came again, gentle, almost rhythmic. 3 taps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. I froze, listening. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, or something else scurrying around. But no, there was something too deliberate about it. Someone or some was out there. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, and eventually the tapping stopped. But that night, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was too quiet, kind of quiet that presses on your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. The next morning, I mentioned it to Mrs. McAllister, but she just nodded, her eyes narrowed. "The pines don't like strangers. You hear things out there. Best to stay inside at night." I laughed it off. She didn't seem to find it. I spent the day exploring the village, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. Cedar Creek was peaceful, sure, but there was something odd about the people. They were all so friendly, coldness beneath their smile, and there were stories. Quiet murmurs I overheard at the diner about people who had gone missing in the woods years ago, never found. Some said it was wild animal, others said it was the land, cursed by something ancient. No one could agree, but everyone seemed to know. When I got back to the cabin that evening, I made sure to lock all the doors and windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, the tapping returned, but this time, it wasn't just on the window. It was on the wall, floor, even the door. It was as if something was trying to get inside, something desperate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling, the wind, anything but what it felt like. But then I heard a voice, soft like a whisper, just barely audible. It wasn't in the cabin, but from the wood just beyond the edge of the pond. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The voice wasn't friendly. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. And somehow I knew it wasn't just the wind. It was something older, something that had been there long before Cedar Creek was ever built. I grabbed my phone to call Mrs. McAllister, but there was no signal. The landline in the cabin was dead too. I was completely alone. The voice came again. "Leave." I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my things, threw on my jacket, and rushed out of the cabin. As I stepped outside, the night air felt thick, suffocating. The pines loomed ahead, black and endless, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. My car was parked at the end of the dirt road, a long walk away, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I made it halfway down the road when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I spun around, but there was no one there. Footsteps stopped, but the air felt heavier, pressing against me. I didn't stop running until I reached the town. I burst into the diner, gasping for breath, only to find it filled with people staring at me. No one said a word. Mrs. McAllister was sitting in the corner, watching me, her eyes narrow and knowing. I didn't ask what happened next. I didn't want to know. But as I left Cedar Creek the next morning, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The pines, just beyond the edge of town, were still, too still. And in the distance, I swore I saw a figure, shape, standing at the tree line, watching. To this day, I don't know what's in the woods of Cedar. But I know one thing. It's not the kind of place you wander into, and it's definitely not the kind of place you wander out of. The pines have a way of keeping people, and once you hear the whisper, it's already too late. If you ever find yourself near Cedar Creek, remember this. Don't listen to the whispers. Just keep driving, because in that town, there's no escaping what's waiting in the pines.